Where we left off last time, we were talking about the goodwill as good in itself. The goodwill is the only unconditionally good or worthy thing. Now, just to be fully clear, the goodwill with regard to morality is selflessly motivated and free of ulterior incentives or motives. So, for example, a good will is a will that has what Kant calls respect for the moral law, but respect for the moral law is not merely wishing to do what morality bids us, but wishing to do what morality bids us to do because it is what morality bids us to do and not for any reason above and beyond that. What exactly does that mean? What's the significance of that? Well, to point that out, we should now introduce a concept called inclination. Two, really. Inclination, this is at the bottom one, morality for its own sake on the hand, and another one, which will be on the flip side, maxims. So the way Kant thinks that our actions work in decision-making is that there are essentially two components. One component is a rule that we're following. Now, this could be as simple as when I see a penny, I pick it up. And then you could add caveats to it, unless it's really gross and in the muck, right? Or unless I'm in a real hurry. These maxims can be part of a hierarchy or a system. So the reason I subscribe to see a penny, I'll pick it up, all else being equal, is because I will seek to gain remuneration or money, unless it is inconvenient and such and such and such. Okay? So we have a series of rules which we give ourselves, policies, and these are maxims. Anytime we have an action, in addition to there being some kind of maxim that describes why we're doing what we're doing, there's also a motive. So motive and a maxim gives you an action. And they're basically only the basic kind of motivation that we have is what he calls inclinations. An inclination is the desire for some specific end. So we all have all kinds of specific ends that we are out to pursue. I want candy. Bump, 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 bump. Or I want this lecture to go well today, right? And I have a certain desire for these things. This is an inclination. Many of these inclinations are natural. They owe to our sort of animality, our being physical living beings. However they arise, wherever they come from, that's not, for Kant, the interesting question. They motivate us to get what we want, and they are the wanting of the what we want. Okay, so there are various maxims. There are inclinations to satisfy certain specific ends. Okay? Now, there is, and today we're going to get clear on what this is, there is a moral law and a system of duties. So suppose it is our moral responsibility not to lie or cheat. Okay? Now, I might be satisfying that for reasons other than the fact that it's the right thing to do. So, for example, Kant discusses the honest shopkeeper who is shrewd, who gives correct change to his customers, even though it's 1785 and many of them maybe lack basic numeracy. Well, they probably have numeracy, they can count, but they're not great at math probably. Or who gives the correct bills back to the blind man who, hands him certain currency, right? Because all U.S. bills are the same. Now we're no longer in Enlightenment era Prussia. We're now in America, and all the bills are the same size. So how would you know? And he does this. He's honest. He doesn't cheat his customers, but simply for the reason that he wants a good reputation. Okay? He wants the reputation of being a fair dealer because he knows that that's good for business. It is good for business to be an honest businessman. His incentive, his motivation is an inclination, let us say, for success in business or for money. The maxim that he's following, it would be this: I will be honest in my dealings with others when it suits me to get my way, or when it favors my business, or simply put, when it gets me what I want. If it became, since he's acting from inclination, if being dishonest were to satisfy his wants and needs, if that was to get him what he wanted, then he would change his policy. He would break the moral law. He would cease to be honest. And so his maxim is not, I will do what morality bids me to do, no matter what. His maxim is, I'll be honest as long as there's something in it for me. So, corresponding to having this inclination, and the inclination being the driving psychological factor, there's also a maxim which doesn't fully embrace the moral law unconditionally. We'll come back to in a little bit the unconditional part when we discuss the categorical imperative. For now, we can introduce a distinction. Well, Kant introduces a distinction. We'll now learn it. That makes even clearer this distinction of ulterior motivation or not, and will bring us to the fullest level of understanding of the idea of the goodwill and of respect. So the case of the honest shopkeeper who is merely prudent in his honesty, he acts in accordance with duty. He follows his duty. He's doing his duty, to be honest. He's acting in accordance with duty. For now. But it's merely in accordance with duty if violating his duties were to get him what he really wanted, he would then do it. His commitment to those duties is contingent and fragile. But were he to be honest in his dealings, regardless of whether or not it would get him what he wanted, in this case, further business, if he could see that he could cheat this one customer, that customer was visiting from abroad, would never be back, would never know that he had cheated him, and he could just get away with it, and it would just be more money in the till, and no one would be the wiser. And then he stopped himself and he said, but no, wait. I could get away with this. It would be good for my bottom line, but it would be wrong. I won't do it. It's wrong. End of story. Then he wouldn't be acting merely in accordance with duty. He wouldn't just be fulfilling the letter of the law. He would have respect for the spirit of the law. He would be acting, as what Kant calls, from duty. So what having a good will consists in is acting from duty, doing what's right, not because what's right happens to line up with your ulterior motives at the moment, but doing what's right because whether or not it gets you what you want, it was the right thing to do. Okay? What respect for the moral law is the motive that replaces inclination in the kind of equation of action. We have to be able to, if our only motive for following the moral law were just more and more inclinations, then that would just be to say we're just doing what morality wants us to do just because it happens to get us some specific, limited, ephemeral thing that we want. Which if we didn't want it, we'd stop doing what we're doing, which is right. So there has to be a separate motive here. And the motive is respect for the moral law. It's seeing that the moral law has authority, feeling that authority, and being obedient to that authority, not for any other reason, not for any specific incentive or end, but just because one stands in awe of the righteous power of what is right. Okay? Now, let me make clear something that can often be very confusing here, and that is the overall relationship between having certain motives and ends on the one hand and whether actions are good or bad for Kant. So we've got sort of a negative, a zero, and a plus column for the moral desert or worthiness or praiseworthiness, blameworthiness of actions. Okay? If you go and you have ice cream because you wanted ice cream, okay, and there wasn't something else you were supposed to be doing or anything like that, you did that, that's not a bad thing. You're acting from an inclination, and you haven't violated morality in any way. Neither have you done what was right just because it was the right thing to do. You just satisfied an inclination. Nothing wrong about that. That would go in the kind of zero column. Okay. If you acted merely in accordance with duty and satisfied the moral law in some case where there was a morally salient issue, like the shopkeeper, it's not that you've done anything wrong, but you haven't done anything good either. Okay? The shopkeeper, by being honest just because it'll favor his business, hasn't done anything morally praiseworthy. He hasn't done anything of unconditional worth. He hasn't displayed the goodwill. He's done the bare minimum, in really bare minimum, and you might say, if he thinks that this is all that there is to morality, that's bad. That is, if he thinks merely acting in accordance with duty is what morality bids of him, if he thinks, morality is just there as a means to an end for him, honesty is nothing more than the best policy, that's bad. But obeying the moral law in that case, even though it was from inclination, it's sort of a wash. Violating the moral law is always negative. The reason I stress that, look, acting from inclination is not per se bad is because what gets tricky is what happens when we have an inclination to do what is right. And we also, want to do the right thing, but we want to do that for particular values or ends. So, for example, I fulfill the duty of beneficence towards others, acting to promote the happiness of others by visiting my sick friend in the hospital. Now, a goodwill, in the case of having a goodwill, I would do it even if I didn't enjoy doing it. I would do it because it was the right thing to do. But let's say I want to visit my friend. I enjoy going to visit my friend. Does this therefore mean that I am incapable of getting something in the plus column? That I'm incapable of doing something morally worthy here? Kant's frequently been understood to be saying that. And so, in fact, this particular reading of Kant was mocked by Schiller in his and Goethe's Xenien. The correspondences, the letters between Schiller and Kant, this is Friedrich Schiller, the great playwright and poet, make it clear that Schiller both was on board with Kant in many ways on his moral theory and also didn't think that Kant's view was this. He was kind of mocking what he thought was a stupid interpretation of Kant. But there is this question. So there's this little ditty or poem, and it goes something like, I wanted to help my friend. My friend was in need, so I'm a bad friend, or something along those lines, right? If I want to help you, suddenly I can't be a good friend anymore because I want to help you. It would please me to help you. So now I'm not doing it for the right reason, and so I'm a bad friend. It seems paradoxical, to say the least. So here, here, to be clear, we should understand the theory like this. The person who goes and visits his friend, who would do so, even if hospitals really, really frightened them and their friend wasn't in a good position to talk to them, their friend was unconscious and they wouldn't talk to them and it would just be really depressing, but would go and visit their friend anyway, or maybe their friend is conscious enough to know that they're there so it makes a difference, but is in really rough shape, so it's very unpleasant. The person who would go anyway, even if that was the case, so that it was just no fun and their normal friendliness just didn't please them or anything in that case, that person would be doing it just because it was the right thing to do. That would show the goodwill. Now, it may be the case that those aren't the circumstances, that it'll also be a pleasant visit and that you'll enjoy it. So it can be the case that you have an inclination to do something and simultaneously you have respect for the moral law. Another way to put it is, yes, I'll do this and I enjoy it, and, I would do it. This is the kind of thing I would do even if it weren't my duty. But on the other hand, it is my duty, and it's the kind of thing I would certainly do even if I didn't enjoy it. Even if it were very unpleasant to do, I would still do it. So it can still be in the kind of morally praiseworthy category. Having an inclination to do some particular instance of our duties doesn't disqualify it from being dutiful and being moral. Okay? Now the but there's no real way for us to know, either judging the actions of others or even judging the actions of ourselves, which was the relevant motive. So Kant thinks that we are, all of us, sinners. We are all capable of just simply and blankly denying the moral law, just not doing our duties, choosing otherwise, and we are exquisite rationalizers about our motives. We are wonderfully clever at disguising our reasons to ourselves, telling ourselves that there's some good reason for doing something that deep down we know is wrong. Because deep down, Kant thinks we all do know what our duties are. That's not a worry for him, that maybe you don't know what morality requires of us, of yourself. But you do. You just don't want to do it. And you can find very, very convenient reasons for doing otherwise. And you can tell yourself you're doing this just because it's the right thing, but if the circumstances were different, probably you might not do it. Or maybe you would. Maybe you would do the right thing even if it were unpleasant. You don't know. However, so when can we tell that someone is acting with respect for the moral law? When can we tell that someone is acting from duty and not merely in accordance with duty? The only times where we can be absolutely certain that the person has goodwill and is acting from duty, not merely in accordance with duty, are the cases wherein it is a great sacrifice for them to follow the moral law, and yet they do it. So, for example, we have a duty, we'll see why in a moment, not to commit suicide, not to kill ourselves. Okay. So there's a person who goes through life fairly happily and never kills themselves. Do they deserve moral credit? Are they acting from duty? Probably not. They're not killing themselves because they know that they have to stay here on earth fulfilling their obligations to morality. I mean, maybe they would continue to live even if they were miserable, but how would we know? For now, it just doesn't come up. They're happy. But the man who was miserable, truly unhappy, this is Kant's example, not mine, and yet persevered anyway and kept himself alive because he knows he has a duty not to commit suicide, and to be under morality's jurisdiction, which he's got to be alive to be. So that person who willingly goes on with a life that is hateful to himself, we can tell that he's acting from duty and not merely in accordance with duty, because what could be his incentive? There's no inclination being satisfied here. If anything, there's an inclination being thwarted, the inclination that we all have to get the things that we want. He doesn't get any of the things that he wants in life, but he goes on with it anyway. So Kant stresses that in cases where morality and the various things that we want, our self-interests, are in conflict and the person follows morality anyway, those are cases where you can be sure, or reasonably sure, that they act from duty, not merely in accordance with duty. That doesn't mean that should there be any self-interest in doing something, it therefore becomes immoral. You could go and visit your friend, and you could be doing it even if you would do it, even if it were unpleasant, and so forth. It's just that you won't know what your motive is. And it's more than likely that your motive is self-interest or inclination rather than respect for the moral law, which is free of any kind of ulterior motive. Evan, do you have a question?
Yes. Is it that you wouldn't know because we're poor introspectors, or we wouldn't know because of the metaphysical reason that the true self, this noumenal self, is unknowable to us?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is both, really. This becomes clearer especially in Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone, which he writes in 1792, 7 years after his most important work in moral philosophy, the one that really sets the core concepts in which we're drawing most of our content from, which is the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. But yeah, he makes it clear there that we know that morality has authority over us. If we weren't free beings, then there could be no such thing as morality. Why? Well, Kant follows by a principle of ought implies can. I can't say you all ought to fly by flapping your arms home and save money on plane tickets. I can't say you ought to do that because you can't do that. You can't fly. It would be senseless to tell you that you ought to do that or that it's beholden upon you to do that. Likewise, morality as such, telling us that we ought to do this, we ought to do that, would be meaningless if we could not act otherwise, if what goes on in the world simply determined our actions. So we have to be able to think of ourselves as free beings, and we know that we're under moral constraints, so we know that, in that sense, the noumenal part of us can be free. But we don't directly know our noumenal self. So now is as good a time as any, I suppose, to introduce just the kind of mechanics of Kantian freedom, which he was continually revising because the theory, even to his own satisfaction, never worked. Remember, we talked about those kind of ground rules or conditions for having experience, the kinds of things that, club phenomenon just wouldn't run without. Well, one of them I mentioned was that there be causal connection between things and events. Otherwise, this experience wouldn't be some kind of uninterrupted whole. It wouldn't be the kind of thing that you could say, I'm experiencing this now and later and so on. Well, causality is one of the categories, one of the a priori concepts which we don't derive from within experience, but rather we apply onto experience. It's a template for experience. And Kant thinks that causality is deterministic. One thing must be followed by another. And so that everything within outer sense, what we perceive with the senses, and inner sense, our own sort of mental life as we are aware of it, all that phenomena, is determined. Nevertheless, it must be the case for morality to be binding upon us that we be free. How can it be then that on the one hand, we're free, and free in two senses? One, that we have these laws of freedom, as Kant puts it, that our pure practical reason tells us this moral law. But in this case, more significantly, free in a second sense, what he calls negative freedom, that is that, how can it be that no specific conditions of sensibility, so none of the stuff going on that I'm feeling, that I'm thinking, etc., forces me to act in one way rather than another? How can that be if I'm determined? Well, we don't know how this can work. We can never know how this works, but since morality is binding upon us, we all know, it must somehow, and since we can never know what the noumena is like, so no one can tell us this isn't the case, it must be that our will, of not us as appearances, me, Jason Rines, but Jason Rines in himself, whatever I am beyond the curtain of experience, must have free will of some kind and must be able to make a choice such that somehow me here within the realm of appearances has a kind of free will. So, one way to put this is Kant is what we call an incompatibilist. Compatibilism versus incompatibilism is a debate about free will. It's not the debate over whether we have, real debate over free will is everything determined or not? Could we have done otherwise, all things being equal? Okay. And the determinist says, no, all things being the same in a given circumstance, you are going to act exactly the same way. And someone who's an indeterminist says, all things being equal, you might act in any number of ways. It's not you who causes yourself to act in some specific way. But what we call libertarian, not in the political sense, this is just in a metaphysical sense in contemporary philosophy jargon, and this would be Rand's position, says, all things being the same, you could have done otherwise, and you direct yourself to act in the way that you do. You're the decisive factor. Now, among determinists, there are those who say that the fact that we are determined means that we're not free, and those who say, no, freedom is still consistent. Freedom, and therefore moral responsibility, is still consistent with the idea that we're determined. People who say, we're determined, but that doesn't mean we're not free, are called compatibilists because they think freedom and determinism are compatible. And incompatibilists, or what are sometimes called hard determinists, are the ones who go, what do you mean you're free? You're no different than a robot or than clockwork. There's nothing special about it. You had to do what you had to do. Freedom is an illusion. The compatibilist has all manner of, basically it works by just redefining freedom as something else. But it's the dominant position among philosophers today, and I give credit to what are called hard determinists for being more intellectually honest, I think, and for at least knowing what the debate's about. Because they go, no. If you can't have done otherwise than you did, that's it. That's the relevant consideration. And there's no point in telling you ought to have done otherwise when you couldn't have done otherwise, when if we had a supercomputer big enough 1 billion years ago, it could have predicted that you would have to do that because the world is just a series of dominoes that are very complicated. Kant is an incompatibilist. To his credit, he thinks, look, if we're under pure determination, then we can't have done otherwise, and morality can't be authoritative over us. Okay, good. But he thinks that the way that experience is structured under the category of causality, it is deterministic. So what's he left with? Hard determinism? So tough luck? No. There has to be some other kind of way outside of experience for breaking this chain, for giving us the freedom that we must think of ourselves as having, that it seems to us we do have, because we see that morality is binding upon us. And if you're interested, ask me at the end of today. I can tell you the kind of story of here's how originally he tried to make it work, and then he tried to change it to this other thing, and it didn't quite work. But yes, somehow the noumenal will has to be setting this for us. The way that, actually I'll say this much. In the groundwork, and I'll mostly be talking in these terms, he thinks that, look, pure practical reason, or our noumenal self, issues this command to us. The categorical imperative, the moral law. And by following it, we are, as it were, self-commanded, autonomous, our own self and nomos law. And we're free when we follow that when we're not following that rule, we're just kind of letting our inclinations, which come primarily from our animal being, run us. We're being sort of run by external factors. And we are heteronymous. Something else is our rule. And we're determined. The problem with this picture is that you're free when you do good things, and you're unfree when you don't do good things, and you still have the same problem of moral judgment. So eventually Kant was compelled to change the theory that, in fact, it must be the case that our noumenal self chooses between a fundamental maxim, the maxim of morality. I will do what is right because what is right. I will follow this law that I give myself, versus the fundamental maxim of self-love. I will do what is right. I will follow this law that I issue myself if and only if it satisfies my desires. So that what she didn't want to do, because, he did it, but made that change just because the idea is that pure practical reason was this author, the lawgiver of morality, this beautiful, pure kind of thing that tells us to do the right thing. And all of a sudden, he had to recognize that if this was the seat of choice, that this thing itself could choose to violate its own laws such that we, its causal byproduct, do the wrong thing. But whichever our fundamental maxim is, it would remain rather inscrutable to us. We wouldn't know. We have to be able to believe that it's the right one. Because why do we have to be able to believe that? Because we are compelled to do what's right. Morality is binding upon us, and if we can't think that we can be good people at all, we won't try. We have to be able to. We have to think there's a chance. So we won't know which is our motive, but we have to be able to think that it could be the moral law. Because if we just said, "Oh, too bad, noumenal Jason is a jerk, so now I'm going to be I'm determined to be a jerk," I would be letting myself off the hook. I have to believe, but I'm not off the hook. Okay. Well, we just skipped and did part 4 under the moral law of pure practical reason as the legislator. So what we've been talking about this goodwill. Now let's talk about this goodwill is with respect to the moral law. What is this moral law exactly? Yeah, Arthur, do you?
Actually, if I could ask a question. So I noticed a certain parallel to what I take to be some of the objectivist position is that if we need to do a thing from our consideration of our long-term interests, not just in accordance with it, right? And primarily, as against, primarily motivated by some short-term gain or win. And again, of course, we have a tremendous ability to rationalize our own motives, to do a thing or not. So, the only way that we can really know that we're being moral is, if it's against our short-term interests, but in our long-term interests. That last part is not so much part of the objectivist position, but, can you comment on that at all? Because it does seem to be that Kant is really trying to rail against, he's just not differentiating between short and long-term interests. But
I think there's something you're picking up on. I don't think that short-term, long-term interest necessarily cashes it out. Although for Kant, there isn't in principle a distinction between, say, whims and short-term interest versus long-term interest, or what's really in our interest. Remember that, say, happiness for him is just satisfaction of the various kinds of desires that we have, getting what we want, whatever that might be. But there is this. In a, say, utilitarian picture, there aren't really principles. There's one overarching principle: maximize pleasure for the greatest number and minimize pain for the greatest number of people. If that meant that I had to sacrifice one innocent person for the good of a whole, I would do it. If that meant I had to lie in this case or that case, I would do it. And though you might think the best way to maximize pleasure, minimize pain is to institute certain general courses of action, there would always be exceptions. So in effect, any given case could be a one-off of, oh, well, maybe in this case it would be good to murder this one innocent person because we could harvest his organs and save 10 others, or something like that. Now, and so morality here is just, it doesn't have principles, and it's just this means to some end, okay? Now, if we were to approach our own lives in a way where we said, on this sort of one-off sort of basis, without thinking of long-term goals, and without thinking of principles, we would resemble sociopaths. So some people hear Rand's theory and they think, or of a traitor principle, and they think, okay, look, I form a friendship, and then I'm sitting here and I'm saying to myself, oh, should I go help my dear friend? Well, what did they do for me last week? Oh, maybe I shouldn't. Now, of course, phenomenologically, psychologically, that's not how one experiences it. One experiences it, oh, I want to go help my friend, right? Because one holds this value long term. Or one doesn't sit there and think every time, oh, I know that there are individual rights and there's this virtue of justice and it's rational, but maybe in this case I shouldn't. Maybe in this case it would be okay to be unjust. Let me justify to myself once more why I have to respect individual rights. Maybe this time it's not the case. That's not psychologically what it's like. And there are two reasons. One is that we internalize and should principles, okay, that hold across the board. The justification for doing that is that they do hold across the board, and we can show that. And secondly, the second point is that there's a sense in which, yes, morality is instrumental because the point of morality is life. The point of morality is living. There is a value of morality serves some purpose over and above itself. However, that purpose is not totally free of morality. Morality is, in effect, a part of it. That is, the good life that you want to live is the life of being someone rational and virtuous. So you can't sit there and on the one hand sequester living well, A, that's my end, B, virtue, rationality as the means, and think that they're wholly separate. For the point of justification, yes, think that B is the means to A and A is the ultimate value. But if you think about what a human life actually is that you're trying to live, it is a rational life. It's only as good. It's only going to be as good as you are rational and virtuous. So it's not as if there's just this strictly means to ends relationship. Rather, the means, virtue, morality, and these principles are constitutive of that end as well as being the means to that end. So that and the fact that we need to automatize and principles and long-term values is the reason why a moral person doesn't approach choice like a sociopath. But it could seem, and what gives Kantianism a lot of its cachet against, say, utilitarianism in modern literature is that people will say, it doesn't matter if you could harvest this innocent guy's organs to save 10 people, that would be wrong. You just can't do that. Now, there's a reason why you just can't do that. It's not just because we have this free-floating moral obligation from nowhere. You're not allowed to do that. There's a reason why there should be individual rights. But still, the right way to think about it in that moment is not to question why there are rights. That should be questioned, but that's an antecedent issue. It's rather to say, what's relevant here? This person has rights. We can't harm the innocent like that. Okay? So I think that that's That's useful. Now, okay, we're going to end up way behind if I don't do something really quickly now and talk about the moral law and the categorical imperative. So tomorrow we'll talk about the formulations of the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is the moral law, and it's what generates the specific duties that we have. Okay? But for today, I just want to explain what does it mean that morality is a categorical imperative. So first of all, remember that morality is a priori, and we talked about a priori, a posteriori distinction yesterday. Okay? Now, morality is necessarily binding for us. You can't say, well, I sort of have to accept that murder is always wrong. No, murder is wrong. And it's not like you're special, so murder for you is okay. It's universal, it applies to everybody or any rational being, and it applies absolutely. Again, as contrasted to the sort of utilitarian where the only absolute is the general goal of maximizing greatest happiness for the greatest number, Kantianism has these moral absolutes. And there are moral absolutes, which is one of the things that makes this seem to some people more intuitively right. That, no, that's just wrong, you can't do that. That's not a matter of debate, that's not contingent. But remember that anything that was going to be necessary and absolute, given the a priori, a posteriori distinction, was going to have to be something not based merely on what's in experience. Another way to put this is, and this is another perspective on what we're talking about the motives of morality. There we saw that if you just did morality because of some ulterior motive, you wouldn't be fully committed to it. That would be wrong. That wouldn't be unconditional. Your will would not be unconditionally valuable. You wouldn't have a good will. That's not unconditionally good. Let's now see the point of morality is not based on incentive from a different perspective. If morality were merely for the sake of some specific end, which it might or might not be as experience changes, that end might or might not be available to you, morality would be no more binding than that end were important. In other words, if the goal of morality was securing your life and suddenly, you couldn't live, you were going to get sick and die, and it was incurable, a person might say to themselves, well, I guess I don't need to be moral anymore because the whole point of it is otios now, so why don't I just go on moral holiday for my last 3 weeks? I've always fancied a little bit of larceny and arson. Why not go out in a blaze? Wah, wah, wah. But if morality is unconditional, then it can't be for some specific end, because that end would be the condition. So to explain this, we'll finish today with introducing another one of Kant's distinctions between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. What's a hypothetical? A hypothetical is an if-then. If this, then that. So here's a hypothetical scenario. What if da-da-da-da-da happened? And then when you think it out, you go, well, if da-da-da-da-da happened, then the rest of the following would be the case. An imperative is a command. Do this, do that. The reason morality is an imperative for us, a command, is that we could do otherwise. We might sneak out on it. Did I mention holy wills and angels yesterday? Well, angels would always do what's right, Kant says. They have holy wills. They do what morality bids them to. They do it because it's the right thing. But they have no option. They have no free will. That's traditional kind of Christian dogma. Angels can't choose to do bad. So the moral law is not an imperative for them. They don't need to be told, don't lie, because angels can't lie. But we can lie, so morality has to tell us, don't lie. Or do this, because we might do otherwise. That's why it's an imperative, because we have a choice in the matter, we have to be commanded. A hypothetical imperative is the following. Do this if, and only such something else. So, if I want to go to college, I have to take the SATs. I don't have to take the SATs. But if I want to go to college, I have to take the SATs. Having to take the SATs is binding upon me only if I'm committed to going to college, or some other reason for taking the SATs, so that I can have bragging rights about my score with my friends, or something like that. All of these are particular empirical conditions, these various ends that we might set for ourselves. But morality isn't like that. Morality doesn't say, don't murder if you want to such and such and such. It says, don't murder. There's no one who can say, well, I'm not, don't murder if you want the world to be full of ice cream. I'm not so much a fan of ice cream. I'm going to kill the people who are unpleasant to me. Thanks very much. So whereas a hypothetical imperative is you must do this if you are to obtain some end, a categorical, that is like an across-the-boards imperative, is do this no matter what. You have to do this. The moral law is a categorical imperative. It says do this. It's not contingent on some specific end. If it were, it wouldn't be absolutely binding or a priori. So for tomorrow, what we'll see is that Kant tries to get from the form of morality, that it is a universal law that holds irrespective of your motives and irrespective of any certain specific ends you might have, from those formal facts that morality is universal and not with ulterior motive and ulterior end, he will try to formulate specific content for morality. And that's how we'll get what the specific meat of the moral law is and what duties follow from it, okay? All right, so we'll pick up there. Okay.